Some insults don't sound like curses. They arrive dressed as advice, neat, modern, easy to frame on a slide. If you've lived long enough, you learn to hear the difference between someone trying to lift you up and someone trying to move you out of the picture. The hurt, when it comes, isn't dramatic. It settles into the day like sea fog along the harbor, blurring the edges of things until you're forced to step closer and touch what you want to keep. That is why I am telling this, so I can place my hands on the walls that have held me. And remember what has held them. My name is Maeve O'Rourke. I am 56, a widow, and I run a small sewing and repair shop beneath the greenhouse my grandfather painted in 1952 because he liked the way it stood out on foggy days. We live in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, where the docks paint your cuffs with salt and the gulls punish any open bag of bread. If you walk down to the waterfront before 9, you'll meet half the town in rubber boots, talking about weather in a way that isn't small talk at all. My life, these last years, has been a steady string of tasks: patching oilskins, letting out bridesmaid dresses, repairing the zip on a boat cover that came loose in a nor'easter, binding edges on quilts so old the cotton remembers hands I never knew. I pay attention to seams. I listen for the sound a needle makes when it hits too fast and complains. I like that about work. It answers honestly if you watch your hands. Mornings start the same way. I take my first coffee by the back steps because that's where the sun hits the lilac hedge when it decides to show itself. Blue jays argue in the maple like they own the deed, and the Ferris horn carries clean across town if the wind is right. I sweep the shop, roll out the sandwich board with the words, Maeve's Stitchery, Repairs and Alterations, and put the bell back on the door. The bell is practical. It stops people from appearing inside a daydream. It's also a piece of my mother. It was hers before it was mine. And she used to say that a home announces itself by its good noises. By 10 o'clock, I'm usually elbows deep in the town's life. On Mondays, the fish plant workers bring me rain gear that the machines have chewed. On Wednesdays, it's school jackets, 3 sizes too big on children who will grow into them and then defend them like trophies. Saturday mornings I get the people who want something for a wedding and needed it yesterday. Their urgency sweeps in with the perfume and the fabric swatches that shed glitter like an argument. I don't mind urgency. It reminds me I'm still necessary. I have 2 children. My son, Callum, works in Antigonish laying hardwood floors. A good job for a patient man who likes straight lines. He calls on Sundays and never stays on the phone long. But he remembers details. He'll ask how Mrs. Burke's hip is doing and whether I fixed the hem on the RCMP dress uniform that came in last week. My daughter, Sienna, is 27 and works in Halifax. Content strategy, she says when people ask. It used to be social media. But titles change the way coats do. New cut. Same arms inside. She is bright and quick. And when she was little, she learned to read street signs before she knew the names of stars. I taught both kids to sew a straight line. Only one of them ever used that skill again. There are things I do not say out loud because they sound like asking. I do not say that I co-signed the first credit card Sienna needed when her rent and internship expectations made a square that didn't balance. I do not say that I wired her the deposit for her first apartment because the landlord was brisk and cash made him softer. I do not say that. During Callum's apprenticeship, I sold a few pieces of china to cover his truck repairs because the tools had to get where the work was. These are not secrets, they are simply the quiet ways a family keeps its floor from sagging. When the children were small, I used to count their breaths on storm nights. When they grew, I counted bills and shifted money from one plate to another so no one went hungry. Every parent I know has a similar arithmetic. No one writes about it. But everyone lives it. The week things tipped. Sienna came down from Halifax with a new haircut that looked expensive and a boyfriend named Nick who was kind in the public way. Doors. Chairs. Laughter at the right volume. They brought another couple with them. Colleagues. The words sliding off their tongues as if it were a credential you could pin to your jacket. They wanted supper at my house. Which thrilled me because I like to feed people. It's the only magic I still trust. I set the table with the blue plates. Put a roast in the oven. And whisked a gravy so smooth my mother would have drawn it like a ribbon in the air and said, "There. That's how you make things hold." Sienna arrived with her phone in her hand and the air of someone changing trains. She kissed my cheek and said, "Hi, Mum," a little breathless. And then she was in the house like a breeze, moving things 4 inches to the left and calling it improvement. Her friends admired the wooden banister, the quilts folded in the basket, the old photographs in the hallway where my grandfather stood with a fish he didn't pretend to be bigger than it was. "This is so authentic," one of them said, and I felt my mouth smile over a small ache. I do not think of my life as content. I think of it as work and luck and weather. Over dinner, Sienna did most of the talking. She had a slide deck on her laptop. No one brings paper anymore, and she called it optimizing family assets. Her tone was the tone you use when you're sure everyone in the room will be grateful for what you're about to offer. She spoke about market trends and opportunity cost. She spoke about how tourism was shifting and how nobody really wants chintz anymore. She pointed to the house on the screen, taken from the sidewalk, and said, "We could sell this for a good price now while interest rates are in our favor. Or better, we could turn it into a boutique rental. Minimalist, light floors, matte black fixtures. It would perform. I have learned to put a glass of water between myself and trouble." I sipped mine and listened. Callum wasn't there, he had a job up the road and texted that he'd come Sunday. I wished for his quiet in the room. Nick asked about a marketing plan as if we were for sale. The 5 of us. And Sienna nodded, delighted by the collaboration. Then she said the sentence that did the work of 100 smaller ones. "Mum, I know you love your little shop. But it reads backwards. We could rebrand. Maeve's Stitchery can become Studio O, clean, modern. We'd capture a new audience and upgrade your life." I don't know what my face did. I do know the fork felt heavier. The word backwards isn't violent. But it cuts in a way that leaves you checking yourself later like you missed a step. She kept going. "It's time to declutter the family narrative. The old logs. The quilts. The sign, those can be curated. The rest, we let go. Honestly, you'd be happier not managing so much history." Her colleagues laughed lightly at that. The polite kind of laugh you give a joke that isn't funny. On her phone, she showed me a list, projected revenue from a rental, a budget for a creative studio, the costs of renovating, all in tidy columns that suggested certainty. She had included my house, my shop, and the small bit of savings left after I paid for the roof last year. In her mind, our life was a spreadsheet she could align. I thought of the time I sold my wedding band to cover the last part of her tuition when the bursar's office called me by my first name like that would help the ledger. I thought of the nights I wore 2 sweaters and turned the thermostat down because heat is expensive when grief leans on the bill as if it has a right. I thought of the deed with my grandfather's shaky signature and the photo of him painting the trim with a brush that leaked bristles. All of that sat on my tongue, heavy as the roast itself. I did not serve it. "What about my clients?" I asked. Because practical questions are the only kind that don't get dismissed as emotion. The fishermen, the uniforms, the prom dresses? Where do they go when we become a studio? We keep the brand legacy, Sienna said, and I could hear the quotes around the words. We just reposition. Halifax has seamstresses who can take on the work. And we'd be creating something that lives in the future instead of the past. She said, future, like it had a lock on all good things. Nick wiped a breadcrumb with his finger and nodded. This town is ready for disruption, he offered. He did not mean it as an insult. He meant it as a compliment that required surrender. There is a special kind of loneliness that happens when you are sitting at your own table with your name removed from the place setting. I looked at the cedar bowl where the salad sat. And I looked at my daughter's fine hands, the same hands that used to bring me seashells and ask if we could keep them alive in the bathtub. I remembered how her fingers learned to tie shoelaces, how they held my forearm as we crossed streets, how they pushed pens across forms I couldn't afford to mess up. Hands, like houses, develop memory. They don't forget who taught them their first useful motions. I don't mind being wrong. Not when I truly am. I have been wrong plenty of times. About a hem that looked straight until you saw it in sunlight. About a man who promised he could handle weather and then looked out the window for a way to leave. But I am not wrong about this house or this shop. They are not props. They are work that added up to shelter. They are receipts you can touch, of bills paid. And meals cooked. And people helped along their way to a day they were grateful for. I do not need strangers to validate that. I do not need my daughter to flatter me to keep the facts intact. But I cannot sit quietly while the facts are rearranged for aesthetic purposes. I said, Sienna, leave the house alone. My voice didn't rise. Age has taught me the trick of flat tone. And leave the shop as it is. If you need help with your studio, I'll bake squares for your launch. That's the only part I'll play. She blinked, surprise turning fast into irritation. This is exactly what I mean, she said, laughing just enough to pull the others to her side. Backwards. You hear help, and you think of baked goods. The way she said baked goods made them sound like surrender. I watched the tilt of her head. She was performing confidence for an audience. I cannot fault a young woman for that in a world that demands a show. I can, however, refuse to be the prop. I collected plates. The blue pattern looked especially fine under gravy streaks. I'm not saying no to progress. I said, I'm saying no to erasing the ground you're standing on to build it. There's a difference. She frowned at the word, erasing. Rolled it around like an olive she wasn't sure she liked. Mum, she said, lowering her voice. A different kind of performance. Intimate and strategic. You know I want the best for you. This house is a liability. Your time is wasted on zippers. We can move you somewhere easier. Let me upgrade your life. I wanted to tell her that zippers are not beneath anyone. That a uniform that closes the way it should is the difference between a person showing up for duty and staying home ashamed. That a prom dress finished on time is a kind of mercy parents can't always afford to buy their children. I wanted to tell her that her life was not a project by which to measure my worthiness. I said none of that. I said, I have my way, and I smiled enough to keep the peace until the lemon squares were gone. After dessert, Sienna took a photograph of the table and posted it. I know this because she laughed when her phone buzzed and said, they love the cozy, old world vibe. She used a filter that made my mother's tablecloth look whiter than it is. Later, her story, visible for 24 hours and then gone like a weather warning, featured a shot of the house from the street with the caption, someday. I printed it the next morning on the old inkjet because vanishing compliments I can live without. But vanishing intentions bother me. When they left, the house exhaled in the way old houses do. Grateful to be returned to their original volume. I washed the plates and set them in the rack my husband built the summer before he got sick. The water steamed in a way I've always found calming. It gave the illusion of lifting whatever was heavy and taking it off in small clouds. The illusion held as long as my hands stayed in the sink. When I dried them, the weight returned as if it had only stepped aside to let a dish pass. I did what I always do when I am too full of words to trust them. I tended to tasks that will not lie to me. I put the leftover roast into 2 containers. One for Callum. One for Mrs. Burke, who had just come home from physio and deserved the chlorinated mercy of not cooking. I swept under the table and found one of Nick's receipts. Dropped unnoticed. I slid it into a drawer and made a note in my head to start a new folder for paper that tells on people without meaning to. Then I climbed the narrow stairs that know my footfall and went to the bedroom where the old cedar chest sits at the end of the bed like a dog that never asks to be walked. The chest holds the box that holds our papers. People keep their history in different places: hard drives, cloud services, human memory. I trust paper because it is humble and suffers silently until you need it. Inside the box are the deed to the house. Oil spotted at the edges from careless hands long before mine, my grandfather's work logs from the boat, my marriage certificate and the letter from the hospital that changed everything, insurance policies that still thicken my breath when I see the typed numbers. There are receipts from Siena's university and the contract from the internship that promised a stipend and delivered a claim instead. There is a photocopy of the town's small notice confirming my shop's business name. There is the will, written years ago when I was too busy to think about the future beyond children needing shoes. I sat on the edge of the bed and read quietly until the pressure in my chest let me breathe normally again. Night settled without ceremony. We do not have the dramatic sunsets brochures promise. We have a slow gray that admits, eventually, that it is dark. I made tea and stood by the kitchen window and watched the streetlight pick out the scuffs on the asphalt where the plow always bites too low. Somewhere a dog barked once. Bored with its own insistence. I thought of the word, backwards, and its cousins, stuck. Outdated. Sentimental. They all mean the same thing when you put them in a family sentence. Make room for me by moving your life. There is a kind of pride I don't trust. It puffs and snorts and forbids laughter. But there is another kind I have come to rely on. It's small and steady and refuses to let anyone rearrange the facts. That pride kept my hand from writing an angry message to my daughter at 11 at night. It guided me to the drawer with the lined paper and the pencil that stays sharp because I hand sharpen it. I made a list of what I know: the market for heritage homes, the town's fondness for keeping what looks like itself, the process to apply for historical status, the way banks speak when guarantees are present and when they are not. I did not make a plan. I made a map. Plans pretend to control weather. Maps remind you where the high ground is. In the morning, the harbor smelled of diesel and bread. The grocery truck had been early. And the town felt grateful for it the way towns do when a routine holds. I opened the shop and sewed a strip of reflective tape onto a jacket for a man whose wife worries more when dark falls early. I hemmed 2 pairs of trousers for someone starting a new job at the hardware store. I stitched the hem by hand because the machine can leave a line a certain kind of manager sees before he sees the person wearing the pants. I measured a girl for her first prom dress and told her to bring the shoes she planned to wear. Heels change a posture you didn't know you had. The day, thank God, did what days do when you keep faith with them. At lunch, I ate a sandwich over the counter with the paper spread out beneath it. The town council had posted its agenda. I made a note of a session 2 weeks out, Heritage Designations Information Night. With someone from the province answering questions. I circled it with my pencil. Then circled it again because sometimes you need to teach your eye what to pay attention to. I do not think of myself as a political person. But I respect processes that keep people from being steamrolled. When the phone was quiet, I called the number at the bottom of the notice. A woman picked up with a voice that did not try to sound larger than it had to. She told me what documents I would need if I wanted to apply for temporary heritage protection while a full application was reviewed. I wrote politely and exactly. I did not mention daughters or boyfriends or nicknames. Paper does not care about your feelings. That is why it is useful. That afternoon, Sienna posted a podcast episode titled, Scaling the Unscalable: How to Turn Family Assets into Growth. Someone sent it to me, thinking I would be proud. I listened for 10 minutes and heard my house described without its name. I heard my shop referred to as a legacy brand stuck in a low-value segment. I turned it off, not because I was hurt, though I was, but because the dog next door chose that exact moment to bark at a squirrel. And I decided to be loyal to real life. Mrs. Burke came by at 4 for her hem repair and left with the roast. She stood in my doorway and said, "You look tired round the eyes," which is something friends our age are allowed to say. I told her the truth in one sentence and did not embroider it. She made a small noise, half sympathy, half exasperation with youth, and then said, "I'll swing by the church office tomorrow and see if they've got the forms you want." The secretary keeps everything. In a small town, the word secretary is a blessing. It means someone who knows where truth is filed. When I closed the shop, the sky had already folded into its evening color. I locked the door and ran my finger along the carved letters on the sign, Maeve's Stitchery. My late husband carved them on the kitchen table while the stew simmered and Sienna did her spelling words in an accent that did not last because the girls at school teased it right out of her. The letters are not perfect. If you look closely, the V sits a little higher than the A and there's a shallow nick in the E where the chisel slipped. Imperfections tell you a person was here. They tell a story no brand guide can flatten unless you let it. Inside, I turned off the front lights and left the lamp by the sewing machine on because it has become a small lighthouse in my evenings, gathering me toward the chair where the day ends gently. I printed the photograph from Sienna's story and slid it into a plastic sleeve. I labeled it with the date, in my own hand, because dates matter when people pretend they didn't mean what they said. Then I went upstairs and carried the cedar chests box to the kitchen table, where I spread the documents in the order the woman on the phone had told me they'd like to see them: deed, photographs, evidence of continuous use, any connection to historical events, letters from community members. I added a note to myself at the top: tell the truth plainly. Don't tidy it into something prettier than it is. I slept badly, not because I was uncertain but because certainty can be noisy at first. It takes a few nights to fold itself into a shape you can rest against. When I woke before the alarm, I made tea, a habit older than my marriage, older than the shop, and older than the version of myself that believes I must be liked to be right. I stood at the window and watched a young man scraping his windshield with a loyalty card. The music from his car was too loud for the hour, but the cold softened it into something almost kind. When the kettle clicked, I poured water into the mug with the hairline crack that only shows when it's full. I held it in both hands, letting the heat teach my knuckles a small lesson in mercy. I looked at the clock and counted the hours until I could stop by the church office for letters of support. I thought of the builder who might already have measured my porch steps and said to his partner, "Easy fix." I thought of my daughter, who, in her small apartment with high ceilings and polished floors, might be sitting cross-legged with her laptop open, framing my life in a way strangers would clap for. I did not hate her for that. I simply refused to let the clapping drown out the sound of my bell. By mid-morning, the shop was full of the modest crises I prefer, a zipper that needed coaxing, a curtain whose hem had collapsed under winter's laundry schedule, a parka whose Velcro had lost its teeth. I mended each with the satisfaction of someone who knows exactly how long a thing will take. People paid and thanked me and told me bits of their day. When the door shut behind the last customer, the bell sounded like a good word spoken at the right time, enough. Later, as the day thinned, I wrote a letter to myself. Not the kind you hide under a mattress for 20 years. Just a short note with 3 sentences. Remember the house holds stories the money cannot count. Remember the shop holds the town together in places no one photographs. Remember that love can speak kindly and still be wrong. I folded it and put it in the cedar box alongside the deed because if I forget, I want my future self to open the lid and find the reminder sitting there like a friend who did not move away. That evening, the phone buzzed. Sienna's message was bright. Think about what I said? I can line up a developer to come by Saturday. It'll be good for you. Mum, trust me. I looked at the words. So sure of themselves. I typed back. No developer. I'll make oatmeal cookies if you want to visit. I deleted the cookies part. Then put it back. Then left it. She read it, 3 dots rising and falling like breath, and then sent a thumbs up that contained everything and nothing. I set the phone down and went to the window. The lilac hedge was a black shape against the snow. It sleeps all winter with a patience I copy when I can. People think turning a life upside down requires a demolisher's tools. I have those. In my way, a seam ripper, sharp shears, a needle that can unpick without leaving a scar. But mostly, when change comes, it starts with naming things accurately and placing papers where the light will hit them. It starts with sweeping your own floor so you have room to move. It starts with remembering that love is not a hall pass to rewrite the ledgers that keep a family honest. Before bed, I opened the old logbook my grandfather kept when he went out on the boat. He was a practical man, not given to speeches. And his writing is a straight line across the page, even when the sea said otherwise. He recorded weather, catch, repairs made in field, and once, in pencil darker than the rest, a note that read, "Turned her before she turned us." He meant the boat in a squall. I closed the book and understood something I hadn't known I was looking for. There is a time to let the wind choose. There is a time to take the wheel because you recognize the pattern of waves. I am not young, but I am not new to weather. In the morning, I will take my list and the photographs to the office on Montague Street where the woman with the steady voice will show me where to sign. I will stop by the church to pick up letters from people who remember who stitched their sleeves when they needed to look like themselves again. I will sweep my shop and roll out my sign and fix the world in small, local ways while the larger gears begin to respond to the weight I've set upon them. I will not raise my voice. I will not beg. I will touch the walls, the banister, the carved letters on the sign, and decide where to place my hands next. Some people call that stubborn. Around here, we call it steering. Some reckonings don't sound like thunder. They arrive as paperwork that slides across a counter. A pen that clicks. A clerk who stamps a date because that is what the job requires. If you've ever kept a house standing through a winter on the Atlantic, you know the lesson already. Drama won't patch a roof. A list will. So, after my daughter called me, backwards, and proposed to optimize my life into a slide deck, I did what small-town women do when their names are tugged toward the margins. We step into offices. We bring our folders, and we ask for the forms that make memory hold. The morning started with salt on the steps and the bell back on the shop door. I hemmed a uniform skirt for the woman who runs the library's front desk and stitched a new patch onto a Boy Scout sash. He stood very still because he had been told the patch would go crooked if he breathed too big. Between customers, I laid my documents in a clean stack. Deed. Photographs. The business registration for Maeve's Stitchery. Letters from people who would vouch that this place is more than pretty. Paper looks fragile until you see what it can stop when it stands in the right order. At 10, I locked the shop and walked to the church office because the secretary there keeps the town's memory in a set of drawers that hum when they open. She gave me tea without asking and slid across 3 sheets already half filled. A letter of support template for heritage designation. Lines for name and relation. Space for specifics and dates if known. Her handwriting is neat enough to pass for print. She said, "Bring me names, Maeve, and I'll chase the rest," and I wrote, "Mrs. Burke, 40 years on Montague." Andre from the shipyard repaired our porch balusters after Hurricane Juan. The grade 4 teacher who walks by my shop window and waves every Thursday at 3. In a small town, affection becomes infrastructure when someone is willing to sign. From there I crossed to the municipal building. The heritage officer was a woman my age with reading glasses on a chain and the calm that comes from having explained the same process 6,000 times without losing a kindness for the 7,000th. She told me what I already knew from the notice: temporary protection can be requested pending full evaluation, and then she told me what mattered more: how to show continuous use. How to frame the house's place in town life without gilding it. What to photograph: foundation, trim, interior features, shop signage, and what not to bother with: seasonal decor. Anything we'd added in the 80s that screamed its decade too loudly. Truth is persuasive, she said, and I wrote that down as if I might forget. It is a quality of Canadian offices that the heat is always a bit too much in winter. I sat there with my coat open and sweat small at the temple. And we went line by line through the checklist. She gave me a yellow folder with a tab that said, "Intake," and a sticky note with the email address for submissions. "Don't pretty the photos," she added. "The committee prefers real light to filters." I smiled harder than I meant to. I had spent the last week in an argument with a filter I could not name. On the way back, I stopped at Kenyatta Post. Registered mail has a sound to it, the rip of a sticker that gives tracking numbers the weight of witness. I bought 3 envelopes for notice letters I'd been advised to send, one to Sienna regarding changes to my will and the revocation of her power to sign on my accounts. One to the bank to confirm those changes had been delivered by hand as well. And one for my lawyer to hold with instructions I'd typed myself, to be opened if I am hospitalized or otherwise unable to speak. This is not morbid. It is the ordinary order of a life that refuses to be misfiled. By noon the shop bell had rung a dozen times and the iron hissed the way a kettle does when you lift it too soon. A paramedic brought in a jacket whose sleeve had split along the seam at a bad hour. I double-stitched and reinforced it because some work should not fail at a corner nobody sees coming. I ate my sandwich one-handed while the zigzag caught the edge of a torn sail cover. And I checked the clock in the careful way a person does when her afternoon holds a conversation she is not sure will stay civil. At 2, I saw my lawyer. His office smells like paper and carpet and a faint lemon polish, the olfactory version of due process. We sat with the box between us and spoke the way people do when each word will be asked to stand up later. We prepared an amendment to my will that put the house and the small square of yard into a trust for the town's heritage initiative. With me as life tenant, legal words for, I keep my home until I do not need homes. We drafted a letter revoking Sienna's supplementary card and any cosign authority on accounts that belonged to me alone. He slid the papers across. And I signed where my name belongs. Not once more than needed. He asked if I wanted to change beneficiaries on anything else. I said yes to the small life insurance policy I had nearly cancelled after Daniel died. I listed the Museum Society as contingent because they keep good track of stories in file folders that won't crash. He nodded, the slow approval of a craftsman when the wood cooperates. Before I left, he said, "Prepare to feel unkind for a day or two. You are not." I thanked him in the way we thank professionals we can't tip. The bank manager knows me by the kind of first name that always comes with Ms. before it in public and with a hand on the counter in private. I brought my documents and the simple request to remove Sienna from all my personal banking and to note in the file that any future cosigns would require my in-person consent. We cancelled the supplementary card. The printer spat out confirmations that, to my surprise, nudged tears to my eyes. I have cried for less, the pull cord light dying above the basement stairs. A misfired bobbin that ruined already scarce minutes, but this felt like a small valve opening where pressure had been accumulating too long. On my way out, I met Mr. Rousseau from the hardware store. He was holding a bag of screws and looking like a man sent for the wrong size. "You'll need number 8s, I said, because I know what people buy for loose banister spindles. And he laughed like we had just remembered something generous about the day. We spoke of nothing that mattered and parted better for it. Back at the shop, the phone buzzed with a message from Sienna. "I've got a developer who can swing by Saturday for a walk-through. Great guy. Very respectful." The words, "very respectful," traveled a long way to get to me without evidence. I typed back, "No developer. The house is not available." She doubled down. "Mum, at least do this for me. You're being stubborn." I put the phone face down and finished top-stitching a leather strap for a fisherman who trusts his gear and not the weather. The thread cut smooth and lay exactly where it should. "Work done well," is a clean reply to a world that can't hear anything else. That evening, I organized the heritage application like a woman cooking for a funeral, steady. Exact. Expecting to be interrupted. I photographed the stair treads worn by 60 years of winter boots and the banister my husband sanded by hand until it glossed like a lake at dawn. I took pictures of the shop door with its old bell and of the sign he carved in letters that never quite sat in a line. I printed copies with the date stamped on the bottom out of habit and labeled each in pencil as if someone in a future office might need me to put my finger where the truth is. The next day brought the small mercies that hold you together while you wait for big machinery to turn. The church secretary sent me 3 signed letters by noon. The heritage officer replied to my intake email with a 3-word anchor, "Received." In process. That settled my breath for a handful of hours. Mrs. Burke passed on a message from the school. The principal would sign a note about all the graduation hymns my shop had made steady for 2 decades. Paper moves. People make it move. By late afternoon, Sienna had posted another podcast episode. This one titled, "Breaking Free of Sentimental Drag." I listened with a seam ripper in my hand because it reminded the other one, my heart, that we can undo careful work when needed. She did not name me, but I know my own windows when I hear them described as shadowy. She talked about legacy platforms and unscalable models and the courage it takes to modernize. Courage is a word I do not use lightly. I turned the episode off at the spot where she praised a friend for helping her reframe a family narrative. The lid went back on the cedar box like setting down a pot at a rolling boil. Friday brought a complication I had expected in my bones, a text from Nick. quick look on Saturday would help calm Sienna. He wrote, which is the way people ask you to hand over keys while promising to tiptoe. I answered, no. He replied with a thumbs up and a link to a home staging company. I did not click it. I mended a torn sail cover instead and watched the needle make its stubborn run of even holes. Late that night, paper made another kindness. The province emailed an acknowledgement that the temporary protection application was complete. It wasn't approval yet, that comes with another email and a certificate you can tape to a window, but it meant my file wasn't lost on a desk under a coffee ring. I printed the message and slipped it behind the photograph Sienna had posted with the caption, "Someday." Because one day another person might need to see the order in which our hopes and our paperwork arrived. Saturday morning came bright, the harbor giving off that clean steel smell it likes when the wind skims from the north. I put the "closed for 1 hour" sign in the window and walked to the community hall to book a room. The woman at the counter is new enough to town that she still asks for postal codes with the careful respect of someone who knows a wrong number can lose a package for good. Meeting? She asked. Information session, I said. The smaller room with the view of the rink would do. The bigger room carries voices in a way that makes gossip out of everything said. I wrote O'Rourke Heritage on the line marked Purpose. Then crossed out Heritage and wrote House and Shop. Because names should be exact. On my way home, I ran into Andre, who has hands like boat cleats and the sort of manners that make men of his size acceptable to small dogs and old ladies. He had heard Sienna's episode, in a town like ours. Earbuds are not shields. He shook his head in the way men do when they want to signal disappointment without gossip. Need a letter about the balusters? He asked. I can throw in the Hurricane Juan repair. If it helps. It would. I thanked him and went back to my counter. Where a high school kid had left prom measurements on a scrap of paper that read like a math problem. Heels add 2 inches. Please make me taller than regret. Just before lunch, the post arrived with the registered envelopes I had addressed to Sienna. The bank. And my lawyer. The clerk had stamped them with the black date I like because it puts the day in a uniform. I held each envelope a moment longer than necessary. A registered letter looks so small for the work it carries. I placed the tracking receipts inside the cedar box and watched my hand smooth the air above them as if that could keep them from slipping. The house was quiet in the good way by evening. I made fish chowder and set aside a bowl for Mrs. Burke. Who says the best meals are the ones you didn't have to decide to make? After the dishes, I unrolled a long sheet of butcher paper and drew a timeline on it with a pencil. On the left, grandfather's 1927 purchase. In the middle, the year my husband carved the sign. On the right, temporary protection, file in review. Above, I pinned photographs with sewing pins because tape is unreliable in damp. It looked like a school project and a court case at once. That felt right. Truth thrives where both are welcome. Sunday brought Callum, boots clean enough to pass his own inspection. He stood in the doorway and read the wall like a job site plan. He did not call it impressive. He said, "I'll fix that bottom stair squeak this week," and it landed in me like a kindness the size of a loaf. I told him no developer would be swinging by. In Nick's words, and he nodded in the way men nod when their hands are already at the right level to catch something that might fall. We did not talk long. He had to get back up the road, and I had a stack of hemming to finish before supper. He took the 2 containers of chowder without arguing and promised to return the lids. Which is all any mother asks of adult children besides decency. Monday put me back into the bright markers of a business week. I sent the Heritage packet by email and, because I am me, printed a copy and delivered it in person to the municipal office. I received a file number on a yellow sticky I pressed into the seam of my notebook where important things hide. I dropped into the bank to initial a form I had missed and came home to find a message from a journalist at the local paper asking for comment on a trend we're seeing: adult children proposing to monetize family properties. I did not answer that day. Stories deserve to be told without the heat of a fresh wound. I would speak later, when my voice had had time to choose its temperature. In the afternoon, Sienna called. She skipped the part where she asked how I was. "You sent me a registered letter," she said, making it sound as if I had mailed a threat. "I updated my will," I replied, the calm voice I use with policemen at checkpoints and doctors who apologize for delays. "And I revoked your signature on my accounts. It's simpler." She exhaled a fraction too close to the microphone. "You're making this difficult," she said. "No," I answered. "I am making it accurate." Then I told her what I would say to any client who mistook convenience for fairness: if you want something, ask for it. Don't rename my life first. That night, I listened to the furnace click on and off with the good rhythm of a machine that knows its purpose. I wrote down everything I could recall from the call while it was still bright in my mind. I kept the notes with the registered mail receipts. Evidence is not an accusation, it is the outline of an honest story when memory is asked to perform. Midweek, pressure found its way into the seams. Sienna posted photographs of mood boards, light wood, black fixtures, a plant that cannot survive our winters at a price that would buy boots for 3 fishermen, and beneath them, a caption that read, "Some people are terrified of the next chapter." The comments were kind in that they take sides without history. I did not engage. I baked a pan of oatmeal squares and took a plate to the church office because a person should feed the hands that handle the town's paper. The secretary took one, then put the container beside the printer the way women do when they mean for everyone to have a bite before the tray unkindly sticks. Thursday afternoon I received the email I had been aiming toward in a steady line since the night my daughter called me backwards. Temporary heritage protection approved. Pending full review. The certificate was attached. A seal in the corner embossed hard enough to feel through the page. It is one thing to know a house matters. It is another to hold a document that makes a town say so out loud. I printed 2 copies and slid one into a frame that used to hold a school photograph. I taped the other to the inside of the front door at eye level. Not to gloat but to teach the right people where to read. I did not phone Sienna to announce it. There is a kindness in allowing facts to arrive on their own feet. I did, however, send a note to the municipal office asking for a date to present at the community meeting. On the books already, a session where citizens could ask questions about designation and process. The agenda went up the next morning: house and shop. O'Rourke. Temporary protection. What it means. It read like a school lesson. It was. The day before the meeting. A man I didn't know walked slowly along the sidewalk in front of my house. He had the measuring look developers wear as if it were a brand. He paused at the steps and then at the side gate that sticks in wet weather. I opened the door before he knocked. "Can I help you?" I asked. He introduced himself with a first name and a company that made hotels look like the inside of a curated suitcase. He said he was just in the neighborhood. I said, "So am I." He laughed politely, then asked if I had 5 minutes to talk about options. I said, "I have a certificate that makes most of your options someone else's business." He took my meaning with good grace, folded his card back into his wallet, and wished me a pleasant day. I watched him walk to his car, smooth the front of his coat, and text something with his thumbs held high at boardroom level. The lilac hedge did not move. I slept the way tired people sleep, hard and fast and ready for morning. When it came, I ironed a blouse because starch is a small armor. And I tucked the certificate into a red folder so it would be easy to point to. I slipped my timeline into a long tube and shook the pin box to be sure I had enough for the corkboard at the hall. Then I opened the shop for 2 hours to put my hands on ordinary things: a button replaced, a hem pressed, a pair of mittens mended where the dog had chewed. This is how you keep from growing enamored of your own story. You make sure it must share space with other people's needs. At the community hall, the ice on the rink sounded like piano keys when kids dropped their blades too hard. I set up in the small room with the window and made a table of my papers. The heritage officer sat beside me with her chain glasses and her copy of the bylaw. A few folks came with curiosity and a few came with folded arms. Not because they disliked me, but because change makes people's elbows want to feel their own ribs. Sienna arrived 5 minutes late with Nick and a woman I recognized from a property firm's brochure. They stood at the back like a trio who had not decided whether to clap. I spoke plainly. No speeches, no blame. I explained what temporary protection meant and what it did not. The officer backed me with the sections and the bylaw numbers and the phrase, "subject to full review." A man asked whether this would increase his taxes. It would not. Someone else asked who paid for the plaque if full designation went through. I said the society had funds for that. And half the room nodded in the communal way of people who have paid into small pots for years because they believe in what other people's grandchildren will one day see. When it was over, the hall did what halls do: it swallowed the last words and returned everyone to their standard height. Sienna came forward with steps rehearsed for rooms with lighting. "So this is a no to my idea," she said, holding her chin like an egg she refused to drop. "It's a not yours to sell," I answered. She looked at Nick, then at the woman from the brochure, then back at me. She wasn't angry enough for a scene. She was stunned the way a person is when a door they were sure would slide open finds its lock. We did not fight in the parking lot. We stood under a sky that refused to commit to snow and said little. Nick said, "We should regroup," in the tone of a man whose job is to relocate disappointment before it breaks a window. Sienna said, "I'll call you." The kind of promise adult children offer when pride is in their mouth. I drove home the long way because the road by the wharf always adds a small something to a person. And I felt I could use it. At my kitchen table, under the good light, I put my papers back into the cedar box and closed the lid. The click sounded like a thing finished enough for the day. I made tea and stood by the window. The way I always do when evening hasn't yet made up its mind. Outside, the lilac hedge persisted in being exactly what it is: a bush that sleeps until June and then pretends it never slept at all. I've decided to trust that kind of truth more than the kind that needs a filter to be believed. There is work ahead. There always is when you decide to call a thing by its proper name. Sienna will have to face the people she invited to applaud her plan and tell them the applause will be delayed or redirected. Nick will call with an offer to broker a compromise that benefits everyone but the house. The bank will adjust a line item with the neutral gravity of spreadsheets. And I will keep sewing, which is not small, and keep filing, which is not petty. And keep setting my hand on the newel post each time I climb the stairs because a house, like a person, steadies when you touch it on your way up. What comes next won't be a speech. It will be an evening in a room where lights look kind and a microphone waits on a stand polished by too many careful hands. There will be a banner. Probably, because banners are how people teach rooms to look at them first. There may be a slide that says, "New chapter." I know what mine will say. It will say only what is true, in a tone that doesn't apologize for being exact. When it is my turn, I will not argue. I will place the paper on the lectern and speak until the room remembers how the story began. Endings in small towns are rarely fireworks. They are adjustments that everyone can see if they've lived on the street long enough. New paint on the same clapboard. A different name on the mailbox. A bell that rings at a slightly different time. I used to believe justice looked like a door slamming. Now I think it looks like a door being planed until it shuts properly again. One thin shaving at a time. The night I took the lectern at the hall by the harbor. My hands did not shake. It wasn't bravery, not the kind people admire. It was practice. I have been studying things for years. The launch was scheduled for a Thursday because someone had told my daughter Thursdays perform better. She and Nick booked the cultural center with the big room and the small stage. Rented a sound system. And brought in rented plants that would die in a week if nobody remembered to water them. There was a banner that read, Studio O, a new chapter, and beneath it a line about reimagining heritage for a modern audience. The words had been designed to sound generous, like a hand outstretched to the past. I stood near the door for a while so I could watch how people came in, confidently. Sheepishly. In packs that disguised uncertainty. Or alone as if walking an errand. The mayor was there. The counselor who keeps good notes. 2 reporters from the local paper with cameras that make soft sounds even when they're not taking a picture. And a row of neighbors who had given this room their attention for bake sales and funerals and everything in between. Sienna moved through the room like a person who had practiced being seen. She wore a black dress with straight lines. Hair sleek. Voice pitched at a volume that could survive clinking cups. She kissed my cheek quickly, respectful. Efficient, and said, "I'm glad you came. The way a hostess thanks a florist." I said, "Good evening," because there is no harm in civility. And watched her float away with her clipboard. Nick stationed himself by the stage. Reading off a list and gesturing toward a table where coffee stood in large silver urns. None of this felt like an ambush or a trap. It felt like business done exactly as business is done now. With good lighting. I sat 3 rows back on the aisle. I have always preferred edges I can leave without making a show of it. The lights dimmed 2 minutes after the hour, in deference to the early arrivals. Sienna's friend from the chamber introduced her with words that made a story out of momentum, vision, growth, the courage to evolve. People like those words. They are soft and shiny and require nothing from you but approval. The slideshow began with photographs that would have looked at home in any city an artist could move to. There were squares of wood and black fixtures and a woman pouring coffee into a mug that probably cost too much for the way it performed. Then there was our house on the screen. Cropped so the lilac hedge looked like a smudge. And a slide that said, before right pointing arrow after. The after was unrecognizable. The porch had become a platform. The carved sign had disappeared. The wall that holds my shop. The one my husband braced after a winter that punished every nail. Had been replaced with glass. I have learned that anger does not help me think. I let my jaw unclench and put my palms flat on my knees to remind my body that it belonged in the room. Sienna spoke well. She talked about tourism and story capture and platforms that monetize authenticity. She used the word, optimize, as if it were a synonym for care. She did not say, backwards, and for that I was grateful. When she introduced a developer as a strategic partner, there was a short and polite applause. The developer spoke of feasibility studies and unlocking underutilized assets. His voice was calm, practiced, decent in its way. People need to make a living. I did not hate him for having learned a script that earns him one. When it was time for questions, the MC, an earnest man who sings bass in our church choir, invited the room to join the conversation. No one stood. This is the part no one tells you about public life. The pause at the end of a speech isn't only about respect. It is also the room testing whether it has permission to ask what it came to ask. I stood because permission is one of the few things you can give yourself without becoming a nuisance. I walked to the microphone and heard the small hiss that sound systems make when they're doing their best. "Good evening," I said to the room. "I'm Maeve O'Rourke." There was a small laugh. The kind people make when you tell them something obvious in order to establish a friendly scene. I run the sewing shop under the greenhouse on Pelham Street. My daughter has worked very hard on this presentation. And I don't deny there's a good energy in doing things well. I paused there because praise is not a trick, it is a bridge. But I need to correct a critical detail and make a few facts plain. I took the red folder out of my bag and set it on the lectern. Paper carries differently when it is going to matter. First, the house and shop are under temporary heritage protection. Approved last week. Pending full review. That means any plan that includes demolition or altering the frontage is not on the table. The certificate is here. I held it up so the seal caught the light. The heritage officer nodded in a way that allows public servants to nod without violating their job description. Second, I've placed the house and yard into a trust as part of my will. With me as life tenant and the society that keeps our town's history as contingent. That trust includes provisions against sale or collateralization. It is not leverage for anyone's business plan. I said it gently. A person can be gentle and still be firm. I could feel Sienna's attention on me from the front row where she had sat. Legs crossed in the way her ballet teacher used to correct when she was little. She was good at taking correction as a child. It's one of the reasons the word, backwards, lodged in me the way it did. It felt like she had forgotten who first taught her how to adjust. Third, I continued, I've updated my accounts. I have withdrawn my personal guarantee from any line of credit associated with proposals that use this house as a lever. The bank has acknowledged the change. That sounded like a threat when I said it out loud. It wasn't. It was logistics. The way a fence is logistics, not a declaration of war. Just a boundary that saves everyone time. The room shifted the way fields do when wind runs a hand over them. People settled differently in their chairs. The developer, his name was Aaron, leaned toward Nick and spoke quietly. It was not a panic, it was the calm math of altering a plan when a variable changes. Sienna lifted her chin. She is beautiful when she is angry. That is a danger. I looked past her to the back row, where Mrs. Burke sat with her good necklace and a face like a weather report, honest about what's coming. I'm going to say something that will sound like a criticism. I added, but I hope you'll hear it as caution. A family is not an asset class. A house is not an underperforming unit. A shop that hems uniforms and fixes zippers and gets prom dresses right on the first try is not a brand stuck in a low-value segment. It is a service that keeps a town looking like itself. I kept my voice even. I refused the rhetorical trick of rising volume. My daughter loves big rooms with good light as much as anyone. I don't deny she has talent. But there are facts here that are not hers to rearrange. And I have put those facts in order. I stepped back without waiting for applause. The room's quiet was a better sound. The MC, who has survived 1,000 complicated hymn endings, let the silence finish its shape before he thanked me. Then he turned to Sienna with delicacy. Would you like to respond? He asked, giving her the dignity of a fair exchange. She came to the microphone and looked at me in a way that made me feel both older and steadier than I had felt in a year. Mum, she said into the microphone. Then caught herself and said, Maeve. There was a small, sad laugh in the corner of the room where the women who taught her Sunday school sat. I should have asked before I planned. She almost swallowed the sentence and then didn't. I did ask, she added, but I asked the wrong way. She was not apologizing for her ambition. She was apologizing for her method. That is not nothing. After the formal part, there is always frosting. People line up for coffee. Adjust their faces to the default expression they use when they do not want trouble. And find small things to say that keep air moving. The mayor shook my hand with the warmth of a person who knows that heritage plaques make good campaign photos. The councillor told me he liked the phrase, "step into offices." As if I had said something more important than I felt I had. Aaron, the developer, was professional in the way men are when they have learned that projects can pivot. He said, "We'll revisit scope," to Sienna in a voice that promised neither rejection nor engagement. He shook my hand and said, "Respect," which I took at face value. A human being recognizing another. Nick maneuvered like a tugboat. He moved Sienna away from people who might ask for more than she could give. Steered her toward those who would congratulate without probing. And kept his voice low enough that only the people he meant to hear could. He did not approach me until the room had thinned. "You kept it clean," he said. It was a compliment. "That was the aim," I replied. He nodded and then did a thing that surprised me. He thanked me for putting the facts in writing. "We're in a space where sentiment runs faster than documentation," he said. "It's helpful when someone brings paper." I could have hugged him for that phrase alone. The developer's firm sent an email the next day. They were pausing to reassess fit given new parameters. It was polite and exactly what I expected. The bank set a meeting to review Sienna's line of credit without my guarantee. Numbers, when left to themselves, tell a story about appetite and capacity that people do not always like to hear. One of Sienna's podcast sponsors wrote to clarify positioning and suggested an episode about listening to legacy stakeholders. I read the sentences twice, smiled at the industry's resilience, and made a note in my book that words can be both hollow and helpful at the same time. Consequences did not arrive in sirens. They came in confirmations and revised options. Sienna called 3 days after the launch. The keys on her laptop had taught her to think in bullet points. I could hear the rhythm of them in her voice as she tried to stack her thoughts in the right order. "I'm angry," she said. "I'm also embarrassed. Not that you did what you did. That I put you in a position to have to do it in a room like that." She did not cry. My daughter is not a crier. I want to find a way to build something that doesn't require you to disappear. That was closer to the truth than anything she had said in months. I told her that my answer to any plan would be held to the standard I hold my stitching to, even. Secure. No show through on the wrong side. She said, "Okay," in the tone of a person who is not finished arguing but is finished pretending she isn't. Nick sent me a message separately. I pushed too hard. I thought creating an inevitability would save her time. It is a particular kind of apology to confess your strategy instead of your feelings. I prefer it. The feeling will catch up to the strategy later if it is ever going to. I told him 3 sentences I have learned to trust. Do not confuse speed with care. Do not confuse content with story. Do not confuse applause with consent. He wrote back, copied, and I forgave him for the word because we are all learning a new language and he had at least chosen copy over like. There were smaller ripples. A woman I barely know sent me a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for keeping the sign. My grandmother bought her wedding slips from your mother. That is why towns matter. They find the thread and put it back through the needle for you when your eyes are tired." A student from the art college emailed to ask if I'd teach a workshop on mending as practice. The phrase made me grin. Everything is practice if you take it seriously enough. I said yes to a Saturday in March. The cultural center asked if I'd consider installing a small case with shop artifacts, a spool of thread, a photograph of my mother at the machine, the bell from our door with a card that explains where it once hung. I said I'd lend the bell for a month if they'd promise to ring it each morning. The curator wrote, "We can do that." I liked the idea of the town hearing our note in a new room. Sienna and I met for lunch in Halifax 2 weeks after the launch. It was a place with tables close enough that you share salt without asking. She chose it because the light was good. I could see that on her face as she lifted her phone and then, mercifully, set it down. We spoke like two people who once lived inside the same rhythm. She described a smaller version of her studio, a room she could afford without borrowing my foundation. She used the word, listen, twice of her own accord. I told her about a new client, a man who had lost 30 pounds on doctor's orders and needed his coat to make room for his smaller self without announcing it. Invisible work, I said. She said, the best kind. Sometimes. Nick came late and did not order because he said he needed to practice sitting still in front of food without performing decisions about it. I suspected the joke was real. We were polite. And then we were honest. And then we were quiet. None of us flinched. That felt like winning. At home, I kept to the same routines that had seen me through all the loud and all the quiet. Salt the steps. Check the hydrant. Sweep the shop. Say people's names. Write the date at the top of new receipts by hand. I replaced a burned-out bulb above the stairs with a daylight LED because it helps me see the thread at dusk. I sent the final batch of photographs for the Heritage Review. Labeled clearly, north-facing window trim. Original, porch post. Replaced 2004, shop counter. Built by husband. 2001. Maple, bell, brass, surface patina from hands. I do not know whether this house will receive full designation. I know only that the process itself restored something that had been loosening, our sense of what holds. The postman handed me a padded envelope one morning with an unfamiliar return address. Inside was a book of essays by a woman who writes about work the way you write about a person you love and trust. There was a sticky note on the first page, for "remember yourself," from someone who needed to hear it out loud. I had never said those words in public until the night I put my hand on the lectern and let the paper speak. It is a strange mercy when a sentence you thought you wrote only for your own kitchen finds its way into someone else's. I looked at the handwriting and could not place it. I slid the book onto the shelf above the sewing machine where the good words go. A month after the launch, the lilac found its way toward bloom. The hedge still looked like sticks if you didn't know what to look for. Those who know, though, see the preparation, buds like tiny closed hands. Timing itself to a calendar nobody argued with. I clipped one tired branch and brought it inside to force it in a jar. The kitchen looked the way it always does when I try that, ambitious for a week. And then correct. The branch taught me, again, that not everything takes instruction. Some things you must meet on their terms or not at all. In the odd hours, I wrote myself lines that could pass for rules if you squint at them. Speak only as loudly as the paper you can carry. Make the correction once and let it stand. Pay attention to who brings chairs and who stacks them when a room empties. Don't mistake a pause for confusion, it might be grace. I do not think of these as wisdom. Wisdom is for people who have stopped needing to check the weather. They are reminders, like chalk notes on a workshop wall. The age I am permits me that modesty. I have been asked whether I meant to turn my daughter's world upside down, and the honest answer is no. That phrase has a bite to it I don't enjoy. A vengeance I have no appetite for. What I meant to do was turn our story right side up. She had taken a page and held it sideways because the picture looked more modern that way. I turned it until the lines matched the lines of the room we were in. If the world looked different to her after, it wasn't because I overturned it. It was because she had been walking in it at an angle. In the end, the loud moment is not the one I keep replaying. It's a small one, Sienna in my shop on a Tuesday afternoon. Standing by the counter while I rethreaded the machine. She watched my hands the way she used to when she was 5. And then she said, "Can you show me again how to find the bobbin's sweet spot?" It is a phrase I taught her years ago. The bobbin will argue with you if you force it. It likes to settle at a precise point where the tension holds. I showed her, palm open, fingers steady, and she watched until the thread ran smooth. "There," I said, "feel that? You don't pull, you wait for it." She nodded. We did not call that moment repair. We did not call it anything. We let it be exactly as big as it is. A practice passed from one set of hands to another. I will close with the only commentary I can stand to offer after a winter like this. People say families either break or hold. That is too dramatic by half. Most families adjust by inches. A hinge tightened. A line moved back to its true place. A word stopped in the mouth before it does damage. A word released at last because damage is already done and only accuracy will keep the roof up. If you're lucky, you get to make your corrections before the weather comes. If you're not, you make them in the storm. Either way, the work is the same. You measure, you cut. You finish the edge so it will not fray the first time someone looks at it too hard. You put your name where it belongs, not because you need to be noticed, but because stories told without their foundations tend to collapse and hit the people on the ground first. I still sweep the floor at closing, counting pins without counting them. I still make tea at the time of day when the light slides across the table and shows me every crumb I missed. I still touch the bell on my way past it. Not for luck but for continuity. If the full designation comes, I'll accept it with the same gratitude I felt for the temporary one. If it doesn't, I'll go on keeping house in the broad sense, tending what holds. Saying no to what doesn't. Calling a thing by its right name even when the room would rather clap. Some people will call that backward. I call it forward in the only direction that counts, toward what stays true when you've stopped asking for applause. If this story sounded like your street, or your kitchen, or the room where you finally remembered how to speak plainly, I hope it leaves you steadier than it found you. I hope it makes you check your hinges and your ledgers and the way you say people's names. I hope it reminds you that paper, handled right, is a kind of mercy. And if you are younger than me and still mastering a tone that asks without erasing, I wish you the courage to write down what you mean before you make a slide about it.